Hello, and welcome to the So Emotional podcast. Here on the cast, we discuss everything emotions through the lens of attachment, the nervous system, and internal parts work. We're a little irreverent and like to have fun exploring the emotional issues and dynamics that interest us. So come along and hang out. Let's explore the fascinating lands of emotions. Welcome to the So Emotional podcast. My name is Nick Carl here, and I don't usually do the intro, and I'm already screwing it up. Here on the So Emotional podcast, we talk about emotions. We get through the stigma and enigma of emotions. We just try to do deep dives and talk about emotional stuff. And here with me today is my co-host, this way, Angela Wetzel, a certified personal development and relationship coach. And also we have a guest today, my beloved brother, father, Gregory Peter Carl, has joined us today. Thank you for coming, Greg. Appreciate the showing up today.
Yo, I'm happy to be here. It's good to talk about this stuff.
I'm first a little bit just like interested in your emotional sort of journey. So I ran into a friend the other day, and we were having a conversation about he was dealing with some addiction issues. And I started to, just in my own little way, kind of like ask questions about his upbringing and childhood and sort of the different symptomology he had, sort of like putting together a picture. And, you know, kind of asked him some emotional questions and asked him about his upbringing. He's like, oh, my upbringing was totally fine, you know. And not to pathologize it, but just that, like, where a lot of these deep ways that we understand the world and the functions are our own deep understandings of how we sit in the world are forged, right? And so I'm interested in like the arc that you have done. So from your sort of upbringing, what life afforded you as far as a knowledge of your emotional workings, and then some of the work that you've done sort of in your arc of what leads you to where you are today.
Great. So I'll try and draw a particular thread here. Obviously, we grew up in the same household. We have come from a big family. And I would say there was a time when I thought of my childhood as ideal. My childhood had many aspects which were very happy and blessed. And I'm super thankful for many of the good things that happened in my upbringing. But the thread of like, how did I dive into deeper, like attempt at understanding of what was going on interiorly has to do mostly with like bumping up against my limitations and wondering like, what is going on here? Like, why is this like short circuiting? So one of the first times that happened was like pretty ordinary adolescent thing. I was living on my own, and I was between jobs, places to live, schools, and I was like, my stress level was like out of control. And looking back on it now, it surprises me that I did not consult with anyone about what I was going through interiorly. In what I would understand as like a providence thing, that feeling of like, I'm at my limits and I don't know what to do, caused me to try and pray. And that started a whole journey over the course of about 2 or 3 years, starting to pray a little bit more and having this sense of awareness of like the presence of God who is the cause of all things, was somehow like paying attention to me. So that it's part of my like understanding of my story, of my vocation, my calling. But alongside of that, so then when I made an application to study for the priesthood, one of the things they have a guy do is do a psychological evaluation. And they were basically like, hey, because of your family history and the way that you answered some of these questions, like, you should talk to a counselor. And so I did. Over the next several years in college and graduate school, I had the resource of a counselor. Was just part of my formation, part of my program that I was in. They wanted to offer this as a resource to help a guy in his development. which was sweet. I was glad that that resource was there. But you know how in counseling, the resource is only as like rich as your willingness to use it, you know?
Right.
And at the time, I just had a conversation with a priest buddy about this recently. At the time, I thought of mental health stuff and interior life stuff as something to like be managed and set aside so that I could get on to the other duties of my formation, getting my academics done. I can't be depressed or stressed out because I've got some stuff I got to do. And now I would have a much more like integral approach to like, no, actually all that interior life stuff is really fundamental to me being able to do what I feel called to do. And I'll get to a stopping point in this question here just a second. That so there was some good formative work that happened during some times in school, but then I bumped in after, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years being a priest. I think this was in 2018. I bumped up against my limitations again, and there was an opportunity to look more at like what was going on interiorly, like why were my resources running short and I was not handling myself well. That just manifests in ways like my stress level would be so high. I just felt like I couldn't deal, and I would just cancel all my appointments, tell everybody to go to hell,
Right.
and just sit in my house and numb out, you know. And I went through a year where a bunch of my buddies left the priesthood. People in my life were experiencing crisis, not just people that I served, but people that were close to me. And I was experiencing more overwhelm than I had ever experienced. And that became an opportunity for me to say, like, the way that I'm living is not very sustainable. And I need some resources to help me get deeper into this.
What do you think? So, you know, you talked about that difference between you're seeing yourself. When you were talking about doing your therapy, it's like sort of a separate thing, and now you see it as integral, right? Like,
Yeah.
What is that space? Like, what are you paying attention to? Like, what does that consist of? What is the internal space?
Good. I think I don't know if I can illustrate this real clearly, but I think I would just, so I think you guys are both probably a little bit interested in internal family systems was one of the resources that I was taught through a guy that I started working with a few years ago. And that definitely gives shape to kind of like how I understand that interior space, right?
Right.
So whereas in the past, experiencing overwhelm, I might have just thought like, I've just got to push harder back on that and just get it away from me so that I can focus on my work or my life or whatever. Now I perceive that dynamic totally differently. I perceive that like, oh, a part of me is trying to communicate to me, and I want to like be receptive to that and try and like compassionately receive that and work with it. So to me, that would be an example of that kind of like interior space question.
Right.
I do have a question.
What do you got?
Well, so it's interesting to me, this something I've observed, especially like my family is pretty religious. Like we grew up first in the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic. Angela Marie is my name, just very Roman Catholic, right?
Yeah.
and I have, siblings that follow those very biblical name patterns. I think my sisters were actually named after like soap opera characters. So it began with me. I am the first holy child. But so there's something that I've noticed, like with my mom, or even with some of these like old school religious peeps. Now our family is like more Baptist, and I am totally non-dogmatic, like more spiritual type. And I remember having this conversation with my mom about trauma-informed work and stuff. And like, I feel like part of my purpose here is to like help people witness to their own exiles, and to actually allow people to make us a spiritual connection after like a time in the desert of not being connected because of trauma. And I think there can be this sort of idea that the Bible or God is separate from the trauma work. Like somehow that it's separate, or I only read the Bible and that's the work that I do, but I don't do this psychology work because that's another thing entirely. And I'm just wondering like what your perspective is on that, being in the church, but also having done that work.
Yeah, great. So that's a huge topic, right? Like, I guess my first thought is sort of about the historical divide between psychology arising and some of its roots being in sort of demythologizing and de-spiritualizing the interior life. But that all that historical context is not necessarily like what's going through a particular person's mind, right? As they're experiencing these things as separate. I would say this is exactly why I find the project of trying to integrate a Christian, what we would understand like Christian anthropology. What is the human person? The Christian anthropology perspective would essentially be like the human person is this good creature that is an image of God, has inherent dignity, is made for communion. Like that's very much compatible with like the perspective of like trauma-informed therapy that understands like connection interiorly and in community, in relationship with others, is like a fundamental good for the human person.
Right.
So, yeah, I guess to get back to your topic there, like why, in the big picture, there's it seems to me like there's historical reasons for why believers look suspiciously at the science of psychology. But I'm thinking practically about like people that I've worked with, and maybe part of it just simply has to do with there's just a little bit of fear and concern when you start to talk about, just the typical stigma of working with a head shrink, right? They're going to get into my personal business. They're going to like root around inside sensitive stuff. They're going to ask me questions I don't want to answer, stuff like this, right?
Right.
I try to present people a picture of mental health professionals, because I've had the opportunity to work with many now, as like they're coming with a toolkit and a set of resources to support you in achieving the goals that you have, right? Isn't that a principle of like client-centered therapy? Is like they're determining the outcomes, and the mental health, the care provider is like there to provide resources to help the person achieve their outcomes, right?
Yeah.
So I guess I try and put a good picture on it. but maybe it's just it's a combination of that stigma that is sort of generally experienced, and the notion that like, well, God will take care of me. And with all due respect, it's a little bit like I'm sure you've heard this silly story before. The guy's on top of his house, it's raining, and he's in the middle of a flood, and a boat comes by, and the guy says, God will take care of me. And then the helicopter comes by.
Yeah.
The guy says, God will take care of me.
Yeah.
And then the guy shows up in heaven after he dies in the flood. And God is like, well, I sent you a boat and a helicopter, you know. To put it in a more serious light, like, at least among like Christian philosophers and theologians, there would be no trouble distinguishing between natural problems and supernatural problems, and understanding that there's resources that are appropriate for those different kinds of problems or needs. Mm. I go to a dietitian to work on how to eat food that's healthy for my body. And I can talk to a counselor who has expertise and tools for working on interior life stuff that has to do with the emotions and the psychological makeup of a person. And I can talk to someone who prays about developing a relationship with God and responding to God. Like, these things have their place and they can be integrated in a good way.
Right. You know, something that I've noticed is interesting is this idea, because like what you mentioned was people being like inherently good and being made in the image of God, right? But something that I hear so often from like my mother and my sister, not everyone, but this idea that we have a sin nature, and it's like we're naturally like wanting our own desires, but there's something dirty and evil and wrong about humanity. Yeah. And it's like a certain perspective that is brought to like religion, where it's like somehow rooted in shame, as opposed to like love and goodness and potential for like, you know, resurrection or redemption. Yeah.
Connection and generativity, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would understand that as a theological question that different Christian communities have different perspectives on. And so I started off with the beginning of the story, right? Here's how I would understand the gospel. God is good. He creates good things. The human person is a creature of God who's made for God, made it with good purposes. The fall is real, and that tendency towards self-centeredness is there, and redemption is real, and God comes into the scene, and he draws us back to himself. There's a whole theological debate between Catholics and different Protestant denominations about the state of human nature after the fall. And so some theologians would take this view of total depravity, that we are, in fact, devoid of goodness now in our current state. But yeah, that if you ask a dozen Christians, you'll get perspective. You know, you'll get a whole array of answers to that question of like, is the human person depraved? Well, the classical Catholic perspective would be the human person is made good and is redeemed and has the opportunity for being transformed and sharing God's life in the world. So I think would be ultimately positive. But yeah, that is a topic that comes up for believers, for sure.
Right. When I think of the like emotions that go with it, though, when I think about like how shame is so diametrically opposed from our real nature, I believe is so opposite that I think it's ultimately psychologically destructive to have belief systems rooted in that about our human nature being that flawed. And it almost like instead of looking at the redemption story, it's looking at ultimate culpability for Jesus's death on the cross and actually lack of redemption for humans, which I don't really know how all that got started or what religion or like who that's attributed to, but it does seem like it's definitely a thing that's out there.
It was the Zwinglians. The Zwinglians.
Yeah.
What?
It was the Anabaptists.
Name dropping.
Yeah, I took a Reformation class, and so I'm just like sprinkling.
The Zwinglians?
Yeah.
What is that?
What's that guy's name?
I can't think of his first name, but Zwingli would have been in the era of Luther,
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah.
So
yes.
500 years ago in Europe. Yeah.
So when I think, I have been, just to contextualize it a little bit, when we talk about internal family systems or internal parts work, it's a way of contextualizing and giving a framework to work with. It's just a map. It's just a way to work with internal emotional places. Before there is a framework, it ends up just being a morass or a sea. There is no real distinctions, and there happens to be like a lot of we call it like a meshment or melding of motivations and parts. Okay. One of the things that I have exposed myself to recently is when I am in. So I do like a contemplative, meditative walks, right? And the message that I was bringing
Holy pilgrimage of the track.
Yeah, it's like the Camino, except over on the track. But to my deep, like wounded parts that are in a state, like a physiological state of fight, flight, and freeze, of really feeling battered. It's to expose them to, which I feel like is a deep and abiding truth, which is that, like, God loves you. God loves me. I am a part of God, right? To like some of these deep abiding truths, because I believe that like wounded pieces of myself live in a state of shame. They're in a state of shame. They're in a low state of like judgment, right? And so the
just
message,
exposing them to like even just the self trying to reach out in love to them, and can I show love to you? Will you let me do that?
right? It's whenever I'm having like an emotional, the thing that I say to myself, the spirit I try to come to myself and try to come to anybody in, if I can get to that place, is compassion and curiosity, right? In the spirit of communion or connection, which I think, we've talked about on this podcast before, like connection is essential to human beings. It's as essential as breathing. Like we need it, right? So in that spirit of not in judgment, not in damnation, not saying you shouldn't be any way, but the way that you are, and saying, hey, it's okay to be however you are, and God loves you, or God loves me, right? That the war that you are like a victim of is over. That war is over, right? And that you can step forward out of that. So, Angela, it's like to sort of like your question, like I don't personally run into that, but like it makes sense to my, my head of coming from a perspective of like our sin nature and that how we are fallen and that type of thing. But I think that, for my parts and pieces, they are fallen and they fall into judgment and they see a world where they are condemned in a way, right? and a lot of that is in like shame. So the opposite, or the sort of like a countervailing force, I think, is curiosity. It's connection. It's redemption, and it's sort of like your nature, your fundamental nature, is good, and you can rise into that, right?
I think.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Here about sort of, this is only slightly related to what we're talking about here. It's how do you guys introduce this perspective of IFS to people? I found that it's kind of challenging because to the uninitiated, it could sound a little bit bizarre to kind of like talk to yourself, right? To address parts of yourself. It seems to me like in this conversation about what is this interior space, or what is this like dynamic of interacting with these parts like, I found it sometimes challenging to explain to people who are already like initiated in it. I've had fantastic conversations, and in general, I can talk to people about like, be compassionate with yourself in this. Ask yourself get curious about why that feeling is coming up. In general, I can say stuff like that, but do you ever find sharing this perspective challenging?
I don't personally, but I don't know. I feel like the kind of people that end up coming to me have done usually like therapy, or have been like in that, area, in that field for a while, where they're familiar with like inner child work, kind of like having a feeling that there's, something there, another personality aspect inside of them. So they actually take to it pretty quickly. I think anyone that's had therapy, I think in some ways already has like an introduction to there being different emotional flavors. And I think it just helps to organize and make sense of that for them.
Yeah.
But I do know that generally what the big shock is like the level of subconscious material that's there, that's actively running their life.
Yes.
And they're like, holy shit, like this has all been here, like running the ship. And like, and like, they haven't realized the significance of those things, or the actual like power that those subconscious parts actually have in, making decisions or having certain behaviors,
Patterns of behavior. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would put it that way. They're usually also surprised. These parts are very surprised when they meet the self. They're kind of like, what? Because they're truly like in the dark, truly like not connected. And then when they meet each other, it's just very interesting. Like sometimes I'll do some work with a client and we'll have a couple parts that we've worked with, and then we'll introduce them to a third part. Or if one part doesn't know that I've worked with another part, I'll introduce them, and then they'll be like, oh, well, I don't need to do this now because they're feeling better, kind of thing. It's just really, it's very interesting. It's just like kind of connecting family members.
Yeah, it's very cool. I've definitely had those experiences of like a part being surprised that it was being addressed, like feeling invisible and then like being acknowledged. That's super powerful.
Yeah.
So to your question of like, is it difficult? And like, okay, this is going to be episode 19. Okay.
Yeah.
We've brought up a couple times talking about IFS, or just talking about the internal world. And I try to, because I feel like I still have a connection into my own like, holy shit moment of like, of understanding that it's a different dimension. It is a different dimension to the me that I experience, right? So one of the guys I read a lot is this cat, Mickey Singer, okay? And he sort of describes it as you roll through your life, you have your thoughts, and you have your body, and then he talks about, it's a Sanskrit word, it's called samskaras, right? And these are essentially your internal emotional parts that interact and react with your moments as they sort of come by, right? And that, for, I think, I don't know, the vast majority, like shooting from the hip, 90% of people, that the relationship and how that function works is unconscious, right? They don't sort of understand that. It's like they'll have the emotions, they'll have all the projections and the reflections of how it's happening through their time, but it's just, that's just me. That's just who I am. That's how I react. This is what it is, you know? I had a conversation with somebody last weekend about some addiction problems he was having and some emotional issues he was having. But the thing that became ultimately clear to me, it's like I'm like a little bit too far down the rabbit hole, that like I'm talking about certain things, but he doesn't have all the context. And then like it becomes clear to me that he doesn't have that relationship. He doesn't have that sort of aha moment. I've described it sometimes, which I know it sounds crazy pants, but there's a hidden dimension of information and relationships that are happening in your life, right? And it's called the unconscious. But it's not necessarily unconscious. It's happening all the time. It's just that you don't turn the light of your, looking conscious mind and feelers into how it's actually working, It really helps, when you can sit with somebody else in safety and to take the actual moments to be pointed in the right direction for this type of like elucidation, this type of interaction to become apparent. So yeah, I think it's super tricky and maybe it just sounds goofy. It's just having no syntax, right? It's, 1 + 2 = elephant or something. It doesn't make sense until you hear in, right?
Isn't it interesting that like in order for parts work to be meaningful or impactful, you'd have to have some capacity for relationship. But it's as if that capacity for relationship has never been turned inward in a meaningful way. And so it's like you're using a set of skills that you've been honing in every connection that you have for your whole life. And it's like learning to apply that aspect of your being to yourself in a new way.
Right.
Super fascinating to me.
I like to explain it to people because usually they can see it in others more easily than they can see it in themselves. And I'll say, have you ever gotten into an argument with someone and suddenly it seems like they're a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old. And so what you're seeing is a part of them that is showing up that is kind of frozen in time. And that's the maturity or the age of that part that's been developed. And that, is one aspect of them. And so usually they're like, oh yeah, I've definitely seen that. So.
Yeah. And to me, I have, and there's one distinct, and it was somebody I know pretty decently. Whenever you get really mad, and it's just a feeling, I guess, but it's like, oh my God, he just seems like a teenager, like a 12-year-old or 10 or 11, 12, 13-year-old, just because of kind of how pouty and weak. But there was this is probably even before this, but it was just man, he just seems like he's so much younger, I don't know.
Yeah. There was something that I was going to go back to and talk about, and it was, it was actually desire. Because when it comes to religion, I like to look at the world through a lens. I like to look at healthy interdependence, independence, and counterdependence and codependence. And I think that in a lot of ways, there are a lot of people that have an unhealthy relationship with God and religion, and it's actually more of a codependent relationship rather than an empowered co-creative relationship where I'm waiting. So I have this wounded feminine energy of I'm waiting for Daddy God to give me stuff to help me out, but I'm not gonna take actions and do the things that I need to. And I think that those relationships, our relationships with our parents, our caregivers, set us up for how we relate to authority or how we might relate to God. And so to have parents that have incomplete relationships with God and incomplete relationships with each other that are codependent and have, distorted power dynamics in relationships, then we can end up with, a skewed relationship with our higher power as well. And I'm just thinking about like how desire, I think, gets a really bad rap, and how there's just like certain things that are kind of like compartmentalized when it comes to religion. Like it's almost like desire is an evil thing. Like desire is what got Adam and Eve in trouble, and then that it fucked everything up for everyone else. But truly, if like that never happened, if desire had never happened in that way, we wouldn't have contrast, period. There would be no like definition. There would be no like high or low. There would be no naked. There would be no clothed, there would be no naked. It would just be like bliss all the time. And so it's almost like it had to be that way. And I don't know. I'm just wondering like what some of your thoughts are when it comes to like desire and how to discern the difference between a desire that's more like ego-based or rooted in fear, and then God-given desires, which I feel like are so important and so necessary to talk about and to navigate like from that relationship, like to really understand the difference of like what we're navigating here.
So I'm not as familiar with like the concepts with dependence and codependence. The description that you just gave makes sense to me, but I feel less attuned to that insight.
I can give you a little brief like definition if you'd like.
We'll give you just a second.
Okay.
Just that. What do you call this? The theory of emotional development happening through relationships. I'm dropping the key word here. That our emotional kind of response curves are modeled on through our primary relationships. Attachment is what I'm thinking about. So attachment theory of emotional development. And from that school of thought, I'm somewhat familiar with how like you can have weird triangulation in families, right?
Yeah.
And you can have weird is not a clinical word.
You mean like unhealthy?
Thank you.
Suboptimal operation.
Yeah, suboptimal.
There you go. So you can have traumatic and unhealthy kind of attachment. So from that world, I would be familiar with some of those dynamics. But your question about like the role of desire, actually, St. Augustine, who's a hero of mine, would say that like desire is fundamental to our relationship with God, that God moves and forms desires, that there's a whole school of thought that like thoughts, feelings, and desires are like the fundamental movements of the heart in the interior life, and the desire for union with God and with others. It's like central to what we've been talking about here, right? Connection, the importance of connection and relationship. But beyond that, I guess I would have to reflect on that more. To your point about like, can people have codependent relationships with God? I 100% believe that is a common challenge for people in their relationship with God. Absolutely. Could you expand on some of those dynamics of healthy interdependence and unhealthy codependence?
Yeah.
Like I'm familiar with like from the 12-step world, I'm familiar with like people using the term in this sort of popular sense of like a spouse who supplies their addict spouse with, the means of continuing their addiction, that there can be an unhealthy codependence with the spouse who's not addicted, like appreciates the attention that they get when they supply. Mm-hmm. And there gets to be this feedback loop that's destructive.
Right. Yeah. So the way that I would describe like a simple way of describing codependence is really like a self-protective or co-protective relationship. Like it's like acting in a certain way to control an outcome so that the consequences are avoided. So it's almost like, which gets kind of interesting when you talk about codependence and God, because you think like, how can God be involved in codependence? Well, it's because God isn't actively engaged in the codependence. It's like the person that is codependent has a way of relating to others in a codependent manner, and then that's overlaid onto God. So I'm trying to explain this like more clearly, but it could be something like, if I perform in a certain way, that might be pleasing to God. And then that means I'll get the things that I want, right? And I'm a good girl or I'm a good boy.
For sure. Yeah.
Or that means like,
yeah.
I don't need to do anything. I just need to pray. And if I pray, that makes everything okay. And like, also, instead of there being an actual relationship, it's almost like all of the power and the focus is solely on God. And instead of taking any personal responsibility for one's own life, instead of acknowledging that God gave us certain gifts and skills and desires and ways to commune and also like take action in the world, like there's a need for us to like as co-creators, because like we're here on this physical plane, like we got to do things. Like there needs to be like what would they say, like the tree that bears fruit, like we must bear fruit. And so absolutely. I think there's a lot of people that can get comfortable and show up to church, but they're not leaning into the expansion that God is calling them forth. So their relationships with their spouses and kids are also codependent, where they feel resentment around a child's addiction and that child really not improving themselves, but they're also bought into the narrative that that child is helpless to improve or change their lot. And so it's almost like a fundamental inability to actually truly trust that God will support their actions if they were to make moves in the world. So it's just like a fearful position to be in.
Yeah. So really simple, really simple, practical way that I see this is like people sometimes when they're trying to make a decision, should I take this job? They sometimes feel as if they pray right, they'll get a clear sign from God. I'll have peace in my heart. I will see the signs that this is clearly the optimal choice. And they don't see, they sort of miss some of the dynamics of making choices. You ever heard the term like the tyranny of choice, right? That like, if you have to choose between an obviously good and an obviously inferior, it's really easy to feel good about your choice. Mm-hmm. You go to the closet, you find something that fits and is appropriate for the climate, and you find something that fits, but it's got a big hole in it. It's like, oh, I'm going to wear the thing. You feel great. I've got what I need. You move on with your life. You go to the store and you need shoes, and there's 15 shoes in your color and size. It's like, well, now I've got to get into the minutia of what could be what could lead to the optimal choice, and it can be overwhelming. Sometimes when in attempting to discern God's will, sometimes people will feel like if I pray right, I'll get the clearest signs, I'll have the peace. But classically, the Catholic attitude towards discernment and doing God's will would be like, yeah, you pray and have a relationship with God. You consult with family, friends, people that you trust, and you practice deciding. And in the use of the will, in like choosing the good and trying to go forward and do the thing, you get exercise in the ability that you have for doing, and that that there are absolutely dynamics like that where people can get into those kinds of relationships with God where they feel as if when they don't get the signs that they expect to get, they feel as if they've done something wrong. They've not prayed right. They've got to pray more intensely for longer. They've got to find the right insight from the right authority to confirm, and things like this. Yeah,
so it makes me think about the idea of like God made me as a spirit, as a being that I have to actually interact with and to be like in my ego, in my selfhood, right? Growing up, making decisions for me was a little bit weird because I felt trapped between, if I had some sort of two roads to go on that I knew didn't matter which one I choose, I would hate that one, which felt like sort of a tyranny, right? But I've heard from other sources, and I don't know, I can't bring it up right now, that when you want to get good at deciding, it's actually to take responsibility. It's like bring up your choices, like go through them in a timely manner, and then make your choice. Get decisive, because it's through that practicing of that mechanism that where you start to feel some sort of actual power in there, that like you have a throughput through that, right? Because I think if you just stop, and it could be if you just stop and then you are sort of like relinquishing your power in sort of a codependent way to somebody else, that's not good boundaries, and that's not a good sort of practice of selfhood,
I also think in some decisions, like God doesn't care whether you get the burrito or the chicken wrap, It's kind of like, feel into the desire, like what's more generative, like what's exciting, what feels good. But then I feel like we get into this tricky place where it's like, oh, pleasure is bad, desire is bad, and then it's like, but I feel like that cuts our compass off completely. If we're not discerning emotion and we're not paying attention to desire, then what are we doing? That's what I'm like.
We're waiting for a helicopter, Angela.
That's a good topic. It's touches on some profound stuff.
I also feel it's like, I don't know, but I think the way that it's elucidated, right, which is something that we talked about, is into beginning to pay attention to the emotional energies. I mean, I don't know what to call them. The emotional mechanisms, the emotional places that are moving around, right? Because I know that it was definitely some of my parts and pieces and my deep emotional ways that I see the world that led me to that, led me to that sort of rock and a hard place of having two choices and knowing no matter which one I chose, I would hate which way I went, or I would regret it, Like that is a downstream effect of a deep emotional wound, and then its consequences happening, And so like this is one of the questions I wanted to sort of pose to you. I've been on my contemplative walks thinking about, okay, so this is it. what we are fundamentally, consciousness. So I think about what consciousness is as a human being, you know. I am not my hands. You can cut off my hands and I am still here, right? So we just, like, ipso facto, we start removing parts of my body. Am I still there? Well, I'm all still there, right? Well, then snap my fingers and your body's gone. Am I still there? I mean, I guess. Okay, now we're going to get rid of the thoughts. So the thoughts gone. Okay, thoughts are leaving me. I am not my thoughts either. So then I think about, like, all these internal parts and pieces that the way that I sort of visualize it, or it came to me when I finally met them, is that I came across a body of water, emotional water inside of me that I sort of visualize as a great lake. Here is this vast amount of energy that I had not dealt with. There was just all this energy held back, right? So I think about the amount of consciousness, or like being, that is involved in managing and keeping that entire system suppressed or afloat or dammed up or whatever it is, right? So then I think about the work that I have done to sort of untangle these types of Gordian knots, right? That the movement or the flow of time and energy through my being becomes more fluid. It comes through more. And so that in that stream becoming wider and open, because it's not so tied up when all these mechanisms of disturbance, that my light actually shines brighter. So like my capital L self gets bigger. Like I'm retrieving and rescuing parts of myself, you know? Do you find that in the work that you've done, in the IFS work that you've done, in the sort of therapy work that you've done, that your capital S self, the you that exists, the good, generative, God-given gift that you are, has that become more? Has it become bigger? Has it grown?
Yeah, I definitely identify with that image of like rescuing parts. Like a particular part comes right to mind of like, or a particular example of going through IFS steps and retrieving exiles, where I came to an appreciation of something that happened to me when I was, 15, and I saw it in a totally new light, and it was a very joyful experience of like appreciating that there was strength and resilience in this part of me that I had never appreciated before. And so to like receive that part and to take note of that resilience and strength, to just show appreciation for it and love for that part of myself, it's a very apt description. It is like, it feels expansive. It does feel like, oh, my understanding of the self that I am is broadening. That's I would definitely say that my experience matches that, or that feels very relatable, what you're saying.
Do you think that your capacities to live your life in the fashion that you do has expanded because of the work that you've done internally?
Yeah, so I would say I started off this description by saying that I was bumping into the limits of my resources. And that's one of the things that inspired me to say, like, I need some help. I need somebody to help me to navigate this, because I feel like the way that I'm going is just not sustainable. And I feel like after the years of ongoing work and development, I do feel like my resources are more supple. There's a greater sense of being able to not just both like know my limitations and be more kind to myself about like, oh, I need to set a boundary here, and that's actually going to help the whole system function better. So not only like acknowledging limitations has gotten like easier, but also like a deeper appreciation for the gifts and experiences and resources that I have in myself and in others has expanded. And for sure, that has made me more resilient over the years. Super thankful for that.
Do you still have bad days?
For sure. 1,000%.
And are those bad days worse now that you like feel and know more?
I sometimes am capable of feeling like I should have been able to manage that.
Yeah.
Right. And so sometimes that'll sort of like stick me in the side.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I feel like I do better at like working with who I am, you know, rather than like regretting what I am not or can't or have a hard time doing, you know. Certainly still have bad days.
You know, when you were talking about having the psychological evaluation, was that like when you began, like
part of my application process for when I went into studies for the priesthood? Yeah. So
that's really fascinating to me, because I don't know if they do that with the Baptists. I feel like they would benefit greatly from that.
I wouldn't be surprised if in fact they did. But it's funny how, even though they've been doing this for decades, all the students universally received it with suspicion. Like, gosh, I heard, you know, how did the psychological evaluation go for you? Well, you know, I said this or that thing. At least in my day, this is already, you know, so 2005 is when I started. This is already a few years ago. In my day, among my peers, it was very common to sort of mock and have suspicion for the psychological evaluation process and that element in our annual evaluations. So that program does pretty rigorous evaluation every year, including a report from a staff psychologist in the program. And yeah, that was often kind of looked down upon. But I have friends who are helping to run those programs now, and their perspective is very different and much more integrating. Like I said, that conversation that I had with a friend a couple of weeks ago about, at the time, I understood the interior struggles, like interior conflict and times of being sad or times of being overstressed or being anxious. I understood that at the time as like a thing to manage, get rid of, so I could go back to being a successful student and a member of the community and a part of the parish that I was assigned to or whatever. But now I would say there's much more openness to like, no, this interior life stuff, opening this up to deeper self-understanding, the help of your peers, the help of your former formators, those who are teaching you, is actually a really good, desirable thing to do.
Yeah. I do think it's normal for people to be like, I don't want to be analyzed, or maybe to be afraid of what's going to come up or that being bad or shameful. But it's so interesting, like with internal family systems, like it's my favorite thing that he says, that it's like, it is like Jesus going to the exiles. And it's like, what better way to be able to witness to other people about like the compassion and curiosity of God about us than to be able to do that to your own parts and like offer, offer salvation or offer being able to release those burdens.
Yeah.
It's really beautiful.
Yeah, there's definitely a pretty deep harmony between like if you're able to receive mercy, you're going to be that much more well equipped to show mercy. And yeah, if you're able to experience and show compassion and curiosity to yourself, the capacity for that interiorly and in relationship, it seems like those would rise and fall together.
Yeah.
One of the dynamics, this was in a podcast I saw the other day, and they were talking about they had retreats where they got together and had emotional confrontations. It was, an interesting sort of modality that they use. But they would ask people to talk about, well, the comment was that if you ask people, at least in these circles anyway, to talk about like sort of their deep, like their deep wounds or the things they're very deeply guilty of, that they could do it all day long, right? That was actually easy for them to access. But if you had to ask some people talk about what their gifts are, about things that they are good at, that's where people really sort of like get crunched up, and they can't access that type of stuff, and that brings me to the sort of that just that idea that like if you can allow yourself mercy or grace and understand like how that works, deeply, then I think that it goes and it has the ability to flow outward too,
Oh, for sure.
Well, right on. Well, I think
I did. Oh, wait, I had one more question.
Okay.
So my question is, when people come to you with like issues, like what do you think the most common kind of like root of that issue is when they're coming to you for guidance? Like what are they looking for?
Let me think about that for a second.
Well, I think about it's got to be like a spectrum of things.
Well, maybe in some cases it's like triangulation. Like I want you to be on my side. But maybe they're like, I'm guessing like a sense of relief or, but yeah, I'm just wondering if there's like, if you see themes around like what people will come to you for, and maybe like an absence of potentially like things that they won't come to you for, which I think is equally interesting.
Right.
Because asking for help is very vulnerable, especially, in the Catholic Church, when there's this like idea of like confession and absolution and stuff. And it can be very, embarrassing or shameful or, oh no, what's he going to think if I ask, if I.
Yeah. I guess I know that, first of all, I'm not a mental health care professional, right? I don't have a shingle out for like, here's a list of kinds of things that you might consult me on. So I know I'm getting the filter of like, I have a certain status in the community, and people who are feel more connected and comfortable with the church feel more comfortable talking to me. And so I know that puts sort of a certain frame on the kind of things that people will talk to me about. But given that, people are people, gosh, it just seems like there's a little bit of everything. Yeah. I haven't put too much thought into like what kind of categories do I typically see. I guess I tend to think of I tend to think that I can be pretty open to kind of whatever comes, with an attitude of like I'd be happy to listen, practice really simple empathy, and try and be compassionate and curious. And I get sort of a pass because I guess I feel like I have a pretty clear sense of what my lanes are, right? There's there's stuff that I'm going to refer on. There's stuff that I can say like, well, here's some ideas, or what have you learned about that challenge so far? And with a particular person, somebody comes to me with addiction stuff of some form or another. I'd love to dive into that question of where that comes from. And I've had the experience, for example, I have this group of guys that gets together that just is like a little prayer support group for addicts. And we're not a 12-step group. I'm not a mental health care professional. They're convening, and I'm there to support them. And that came about because there was several different people coming to me and talking about the same kinds of issues. And I had heard about this format of coming together for transparency, accountability, and community. Mm-hmm. And the idea that like in that community, there's that saying of like the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, but the opposite of addiction is like healthy connection. Right? Connection. Mm-hmm. And so because these individuals were all talking to me about similar topics, I just said, well, would you be interested? And, you have to make your own decision, and we're going to start a group. And this is a resource that would be available for guys who would want to come. And that group's been going for a couple years now. And those guys have experienced a ton of growth. And, but in that, if somebody were to come talk to me about addiction, like I feel pretty comfortable taking all different kinds of inquiries, because I feel like I have the ability to work with them in a prayerful, helpful way, hopefully, or there's great resources of counselors in our community. And there's other resources like groups. I just feel like trying to get back to your question about themes or commonalities. And I guess I feel like there's all kinds of different stuff that comes, but I get to kind of make an offer of certain kinds of things. And if I can be helpful to somebody, great. If not, hopefully I can connect them with the resource.
So you're kind of quarterbacking. And your main outlet is God on the whiteout.
That's right, dude. Yeah, no, like I definitely am coming with that worldview, like front and center. Like, here's how I understand things. And if somebody's there, great, we can engage in that. And if somebody's not, like, it's not necessarily a problem, but I'm definitely starting off with that as a presupposition.
Word. Got anything else, Angela?
I desperately want to talk about exorcism, but
So there is, like, I've asked you this question, but there is somebody on staff in the diocese who deals with that, right?
Yeah, there's somebody on staff in every diocese who has that responsibility to respond to those inquiries when they come, and they do come regularly.
Regularly.
Yeah. I'm not going to say full-blown exorcism is like a weekly activity, but there's things that people will seek intervention for, and will go through a process of diagnosis, right? And that's thought of as a responsibility that is ongoing in every territory in the country, in the world.
Is there a doctrinal exorcism scripture or something, or a book, or a like
Doctrinal.
resource? Doctrinal?
Yeah, there is. Yes, the short answer is yes, there is.
Do you know the name of that book?
Yeah, I mean, it would take you 5 minutes to find it on Google. It's not
Okay.
super secret.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
the rite of exorcism is what it's called.
The rite. So
Yeah,
it's not a sacrament, it's a rite. What
Yeah.
are other Catholic rites?
The rite of baptism, the rite of
Okay.
blessing a house. A rite just means it's just a category for like, this is the official kind of order of service when you're doing this thing.
Right.
And there is one of those for exorcism.
Whoa.
And yeah, I would say a full-blown exorcism. I don't know how common it is because I'm not involved in that.
You're not on the Ghostbusters?
Not on the Ghostbusters team. And when that kind of stuff comes up, like our ordinary response is like relationship with God, trust in God.
Right.
The prayer of the Our Father that Jesus taught us talks about delivering us from evil. We look to God as a father who is good, who provides for his children, and who has absolute authority over everything.
Amen.
And we can, the ordinary, you always start with the ordinary.
Right.
The analogy that I've sometimes used is like, if you have a stomach ache, you don't start with chemotherapy.
Chop the legs off first.
You start by like asking about, what did you eat yesterday? You know,
Right. Yeah.
there's a whole diagnostic process before you get into extraordinary interventions. You do the ordinary interventions and you develop relationship and you try and help a person, take ordinary steps. And, it happens regularly that the Ghostbusters would do some diagnostic steps and they would say, here's how we would understand that this is clearly not a supernatural phenomenon. And here's a really qualified mental health care professional who can help you address this.
Right. That's what I was wondering. Yeah. Is they're going through that. And my curiosity was like, sometimes like mental illness can really present as, that. And it makes me think of The Way of the Psychonaut. We were watching, Nick, the documentary about Stan Groff. And he talks about administering, I think it's LSD, to this woman who had like a lot of trauma. And then he spoke about, at one point, she shifted into this like demonic voice. And they said it was like really scary. And she was looking at them with like, looked like she wanted to kill them. And he said the creepy thing is she knew all kinds of stuff about them that she couldn't have known. And his reaction to that was to be like, okay, like something's come through. But his response to that was to offer this like solid compassion and curiosity. And then in the face of that, like it wasn't able to continue. Yeah. And then they decided not to tell her about it later that it came up. They were like, well, we just decided not to mention that, you know?
Essentially, he met the darkness with love and compassion, and that was enough to, but to me, like the story was just a testament to the power of compassion and to the power of, love, which makes me think about the power of God's love, and about how those things actually, that redemption and God's love and that type of, healing and energy actually has real power to it,
Which is interesting because any movie that's about like demons and the church, like anytime there's like shenanigans going on, it's like there's real fear or there's almost like the absence of God. If you notice, it's like there's no like trust or faith. And then there's like, oh no, this demon is like more powerful. And it's like, well, because they're so afraid that they're not, they're not anchored in God's love. So it makes sense. Yeah, that would be really scary. Anyway.
Do you have any questions, brother?
So you mentioned that you were into how many episodes now?
This is 19.
19. That's sweet.
19. Yeah.
Do you have a sense of like, how, do you have like a sense of like, what is your mission here? How do you express like, well, I guess you were saying it at the top of the show,
Yeah.
I was
dispelling stigma.
stigma
Opening
and
up this
enigmas.
question.
Removing the stigma and enigma around the emotional journey.
So my little
Yeah.
tirade about like the actual operating between consciousness, thought, samskaras, this deep emotional stuff, you know, it's about, to me,
Yeah.
it's about more reflecting and being in and talking about and living through that as a more conscious piece of life and about how
Yeah.
it ties into world. So it's just essentially like framing, it's like framing and talking about and dealing with the different situational parts and pieces of life with this included part of these deep emotional pieces that do play
Yeah.
an integral role in how life unfolds moment by moment, you know? And it's a lot of it is relational stuff, personal relationship with self, but you know, but it really touches on everything. Every single aspect of life has a deep connection down into these places that need alignment, right? They need consciousness, they need love to actually, you know, open up, you know, that power that's possible, that the possibilities that exist inside of you, you know? Because I think that, like, for me anyway, it's being very locked down, you know? If all the emotions are, it just ties up so much of my capital S self, right? That it's just all locked down in this fight, you know? My mantra, you know, before coming into deep relationship with myself is that life is a grind. It's only a grind. I am just going to white knuckle it, you know, and just fight, and nobody's coming. And it's just going to be a fight the whole time until I'm dead.
Yeah.
And I think that is out. That's out there. That's out there in the zeitgeist. That's out there in the polis. You know, that's among human beings. And I think that it is part of our how the future is going to unfold. Is that these deep relationships, these deep ways that we are formed, is going to come more into light, come more into the consciousness of people, and be taken care of. You know, I just think that I think it's important, and that's my personal vision of the goal.
Yeah, we want to normalize like feeling and kind of like the mess that one can get into just starting to explore these things. But like we want to introduce compassion and awareness around like the entire emotional journey, like into more wholeness and expansion and connection with self and of course God.
That's sweet. I appreciate about that like maybe a few years ago, I would have thought of this journey as primarily one about like trying to manage something that was a challenge, right? Again, this image of like thinking of interior conflict as like something I had to manage, set aside, and get over so that I could get on with life.
Yeah, but mostly annoying.
Mostly obnoxious, yeah. And now I would have a much better sense of like, oh no, this is like addressing this, bringing this to light is life-giving, and it's good. It helps me to be more than I, was, and helps me to be more effective in what I want to do too.
Right.
So I appreciate that like expanded vision of what this is directed towards. That's sweet.
Thanks.
Cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, brother, it's been a pleasure to have you on. I appreciate your time and your attention.
Really
and
nice
your
to meet
care.
you, Greg.
Yeah, likewise, Angela. Godspeed to both of you. It's a super cool project. I hope it continues to go well.
Thank you.
Righteous. Okay. So
All
emotional.
right, everyone. Thanks
19.
for listening.
Oh, my mouse died.
See you next time.
Okay.
Bye.
Out.